Alright, so I'm trying out my new rig, see how this works. So, we are going to experiment with a sourdough whole wheat oat. So, I took a couple of different recipes, a whole wheat oat bread, whole wheat, some sourdough wheat bread recipes, tried to combine them into a single recipe for sourdough whole wheat oat bread. So we'll see how it goes. So I do this in the bread maker just because honestly it's easier for me, less drama, and I can walk away from it and not have to worry about it. So we're gonna get this all mixed up and then see how it turns out. If it turns out good, then we can adapt it for regular kitchen, or do something more fancy with it. But for right now, I find that the bread maker is a great way to sort of test out the recipe and see how it goes. So I fed my sourdough starter, and it's looking nice and big and fluffy. So that's great. And I got my nifty sourdough paddle. Get that all mixed around and ready to go. And then we need our whole wheat and our white flour, which we've got going on here. So we're going to get all the dry ingredients together and get all of the wet ingredients together. So in sort of mixing this up, I tried to go with, this recipe doesn't have eggs in it. So my favorite whole wheat bread recipe with oat has eggs in it, has one egg in it. So this one doesn't, because all the other wheat recipes that I looked at didn't have eggs in it, and they were using, the sourdough ones were using milk as a liquid to increase the moisture of the dough. So I'm thinking that the milk and the egg kind of offset each other, because both of them have a lot of biotin in them. So I'm thinking that we can go with the milk as the ingredient to raise the moisture, as opposed to egg, and see how that works as a binder. If it doesn't work out, then we'll switch more over, but that's why we keep notes, because then we know what works and what doesn't. So this is version 1. So we're going to start with some ingredients. So we're starting with 2 cups of whole wheat flour, 2 cups of white flour. Again, the recipes that I looked at were kind of all over the place with this. Some said, 3 cups of white and 1 cup of whole wheat. Some had 1.5 of one and 2.5 of the other. So I'm gonna just try an even 50-50 split and see how that goes. Hopefully that'll be great, and then we can go from there. If not, again, we'll kind of adjust over time and see kind of where things end up, and then kind of base our next set of experiments off of that. So next up, we want to do a cup of oats. So we're grabbing a cup of oats out of the cupboard. We need some sugar, some salt. So we're just gonna do, now that's the other thing. One of the other recipes that I have calls for wheat germ. So again, my favorite recipe does 2/3 of a cup of oats and 1/3 of a cup of wheat germ. And it's to help it rise, right? So the wheat germ increases the amount of gluten that's in the bread. The gluten is needed to be able to make the dough pliable and to hold the air so that it puffs up when the yeast starts producing carbon dioxide. So in this case, with all the other recipes that I have, they don't actually call for wheat germ. So the one additional whole wheat recipe, and then the two sourdough wheat breads, or the sourdough wheat and the sourdough white, none of them call for wheat germ. So I'm going to try it without wheat germ and see how that goes. I also dialed back the total amount of oats compared to the sourdough oat bread, which is a white bread with oats. So again, I'm sort of combining a lot of these things together. So that one called for 1 1/4 cups of oats, but I brought it back to 1 cup of oats. So if this turns out, then we'll put the recipe out there. But right now I'm just kind of giving you my brain for why I did what I did. Not really a recipe to try and follow, because again we're kind of testing this out. So this is the test kitchen, and so it might suck. So don't follow this until we know that it doesn't. Then we're doing 2 tablespoons of sugar. If the sugar turns out, I'm going to substitute honey, because one of my favorite things is a honey oat bread. It's something that my mom made all the time when I was a kid, and honestly it was my absolute favorite bread, and it was the first bread that I learned to make when I started making bread in a bread maker. Was I adapted a whole wheat bread recipe to my mom's honey oat bread recipe, and then started making it for myself, which was fantastic. All right, so we need to add a teaspoon of salt. We have a teaspoon of salt. And Miss Van Loo is probably going to be unhappy with me on my technique, because everything I learned about measuring came from home economics class in high school, and she was very good, but I know I have been not actually up to the standards of what we did in that class. But for the most part, it works out okay for me. All right, so well, that's hard to see. All right. So next up is, I realized I had started this video with the pan, the pot thing for the bread maker in the dishwasher. And I thought, well, that's not so great, but worked out great. Okay, so now we're going to measure the liquid ingredients into our piece, into our bread maker. And for this, I did a lot of different things with the sourdough starter, but for the most part, actually measuring it into a liquid measurement I find is easier than anything else. So we're doing 1 1/4 cups of starter. So I'm just going to pour that into my glass measuring cup, like this. And this So one of the things that you'll find if you're doing sourdough is that your sourdough itself has different consistencies as you're using it at different times. And for me, the sourdough today and last night has been really soupy, which is fine. It just doesn't rise as much when it's soupy, but it's not hurting it at all. At least I don't think it is. But what it means is that you'll have to add less liquid when you're watching the dough in the in the bread maker when it's doing its first thing. So again, you can laugh at me for using a bread maker. You can tell me that I'm besmirching the name of baker. But at the end of the day, I find it's just easy to do the bread maker to test out recipes and then get fancier in the shape of the bread later on when we're trying to turn it into a more elaborate recipe. All right, 2 tablespoons of butter. And there. All right. So that's another thing that I'll adjust in the next recipe is I'm going to start with butter. But then I want to adjust it to olive oil in the next recipe. I like using the olive oil in the whole wheat just because it gives it an interesting taste. The olive oil itself gives it a different taste than butter, but either one's fine. All right, so I think we're good to add our dry ingredients to this. I just scoop it in just because otherwise it makes a mess to start with. And then one of the other differences, my cousin Anne said that she does this anyway, just for simplicity's sake, is adding explicit yeast into the sourdough. So you don't necessarily have to do that. You can rely on the sourdough itself to do its thing. But when you're putting it in the bread maker, you definitely need to add yeast because otherwise it won't rise in the time window that the bread maker understands. But if you're just doing it outside, if you're just doing it old school, you don't need to add yeast because you're letting it rise on whatever time window you want to let it rise on. But here we're going to add 2 teaspoons of yeast, which is pretty consistent. All the recipes were mostly 2 teaspoons of yeast, except for the one with eggs, which had 2.5 teaspoons of yeast. So, all right, so we are going to, I need a cup of milk. So I'm using skim because it still has all the biotin in it, and it doesn't have the fat, but you can use whatever you like. I guess we don't have any left. So the fat content really shouldn't affect things at all because you've already introduced the fat into the bread in the form of butter. So you don't really need more in the milk. But whatever floats your boat. And we're going to set the loaf size to 2 pounds, and we're going to set the crust color to light, and that's just because of this particular unit, not anything else in particular. I find that anything other than light crust color on this unit burns the outside of the bread. So, all right, then we hit start, and we let it do its thing. And while it's going through that, we have to watch it, and it just takes a little bit of time because it's going through its cycle, and it just stops every little bit. Now, most of the recipes say add 2/3 to 3/4 of a cup of liquid, and I find that how the amount of liquid or the runniness of my sourdough, I have to bump that up. So I'm generally preparing at least a cup of milk to add to my dough because mine doesn't have, apparently mine's not as juicy as the one in the recipe books that I looked at. So now it just does a intermittent thing, which is kind of irritating, but so you gotta wait for that to finish before you can get back to mixing it. But it's looking pretty good, so we'll see how it turns out. I'll add a little bit more liquid once it gets past this erratic dough step, and we'll see how it goes. We'll keep you posted.